I think our ways of making sense of the world through images are as old as we've been human. And I think that's something when we think about what goes on in classrooms, we're still okay with art up on the walls, but art as a way of figuring out our world, art as a vital literacy, that's been left out. And I think it's kind of a travesty and something I hope I can speak to. Because this is really very much one of the things I think that makes us human. But let's talk about comics very specifically right now. Folks in this room heard of Scott McCloud's 1993 comic about comics, Understanding Comics? So we'll start with Scott's definition. I think it's a nice starting point, and then we're going to move past that. So he says, juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. So basically that means, here's my fist, I'm going to draw a box around it, and then I'm going to stretch it out here, I'm going to draw a box around it. You guys are all going to make the action happen. Comics are static, nothing moves, they're like the flattest kind of thing you can get. But because of the way our eyes connect the dots there, we make the action happen. The reader animates it. And his big idea is about comics as this sequential form. And I've represented it here with the change in seasons. And there's that sense of time moving from this to this to this to this. So you can see it in this page. So we read left to right, top to bottom. But because it's visual, you can't help but see the whole thing at the same time, which means you're starting to make connections, whether you want to or not, from the lower right back up to the upper left. And that whole page is holding together in a way that changes it in some ways. And in fact, within any single panel, you're connecting, do you read the box first, or do you read where the marmot, I forget what it's Ricky Tikki Tavi, where that is, which part comes first? So that's a pretty interesting question, the fact that this sort of hierarchy of reading, which, if this was a novel, you would say, yes, I read this way, this is how you read, has been sort of broken up, and it's much more interconnected and all at once. So I think that idea that comics are both sequential and simultaneous is where they get really exciting, at least for me. And that's what we're going to get into. So this is a one page from Watchmen, which is a very celebrated comic, or maybe it's a graphic novel. And so that center panel, which I've blown up here, he says, there is no future, there is no past, do you see? And I think that is intentional meta-commentary on how comics work. So in some sense, we could say that upper left panel happens first, and the lower right panel happens last. And that's, in some sense, yes, you do read that way. But in fact, the lower right-hand panel comes 30 years before the upper left. And time and space are sort of mashed together in an unusual sort of way here. And we can think about that. I think about it in terms of how our brain works, and I think we have two kinds of awareness, and that is we're aware of the sequential moments. Like you've come to this talk, you've got something else you've got to do in an hour, you had something you did this morning, so you're experiencing time in a fairly linear fashion. But at the same time, you're also having things I've said that are making thoughts go off to the side here, or other thoughts about what you're going to do later in the day. So while we move through time in a somewhat linear fashion, or maybe we don't, but let's assume we do, we sort of wander in our thoughts in many directions at the same time. So I think that interlacing of sequential and simultaneous that comics do a really good job of capturing something about how things go on in our heads. And so here's some examples from comics that aren't mine that I think speak to that. So this is a comic about the Louvre, and if we cut it up into 9 panels and I showed it to you as a slideshow, I think you'd miss something. And I think you see the sort of super image that's going on behind that. And if you know the Louvre and the pyramid and all that, that's a significant part to the storytelling. But when do you read it? Did you read that first? Did you read it, or did that come to you all at once? I mean, that's changing the reading. This is Gasoline Alley from the 1930s. And we can see our characters sort of bumbling along sequentially through it, but it's a single simultaneous scene. So those two ways of thinking are going on at the same time. And we'll do one more, and it's a joke, so I'll wait till you get it. That was fast, somebody over there. So the only way this little guy can get the fruit is because time and space are mashed up in this unusual way. And I think that really is a very exciting thing about this form. You can't, in a film, for all films, great powers, it's hard to move backwards in the film. Film, you have to go at the pace of the cogs or whatever it is now of how the film turns. And so for me, I'm very interested in comics as a way to not illustrate things, but to embody them through the visuals. So this is a page from a chapter on ruts or routine, and I was contrasting my wife's commute in Manhattan, which was different every day in different places and always changing, with the typical commute, which is we go out and we go back, we go out and we go back. And so instead of putting one here and the other here, in the background, the grid has the out and back. And so there's this sort of base thing that happens the whole time. But in the foreground, I'd noticed the sort of connection between Manhattan's shape and a falling leaf or a falling feather. And I was thinking about how her route was sort of a drift, or the Situationist Internationale's derive. She was sort of drifting through the city. And so I have the contrast of her drift, and I've mapped it out differently on all those, against that background. So the page is both, I guess, illustrating it, but it's also doing those things at the same time. And I think that's a really exciting potential for where comics can go. This is not from the book. This is from a piece I did for the Boston Globe last year. It's a piece about entropy, and it never says the word entropy, but that's what it's about. It's about how things fall apart, whether sand runs down or your coffee gets cold. But it's also about the few moments where things spin back up against that stream of downhill. And so it's sort of about these vortices. So the shape of it itself does a lot of that thing. And in fact, this comic, the middle section, you sort of read down, and then you come to the center, and then you come back out. So it asks you to read right to left in one section, and it asks you to read back up, which is difficult to do, and it was insane to figure out. I don't recommend it. But I think that question of changing the way we read, changing the direction you read, I mean, that's a pretty unusual question. When you read things, when do those moments happen? I think that's something we really can play with and do a lot of things about our thinking in comics. And so that becomes a question, is what do our thoughts look like? Before you put them out into some form, what do your thoughts look like in your head? I know it's kind of a big room, but I'm going to ask another question. Does anybody want to say, what does your thoughts look like before you get them out? I think we can say for sure, it's probably not rows and rows of text, but I like to think about them because I like to cherry pick my answers here, is that I think we do have linear moments, we do have sequence going on, but we also do have the sort of sideways tangents that I think comics can handle so well. And so this is Chris Ware, extremely famous contemporary cartoonist. I think his comics talk about the way to capture fragments of memory in these sort of little images, and they move off to the side. And I think you can think about this. When you try to get your thoughts out, maybe you're having a hard time writing it down, but you go out for a run, and when you're moving, things start to make sense. And I think that act of movement, that act of finding other directions to go, allows your mind to find the ways that it needs to. Whether you end up making comics or whether you bring it back down to a textual form because you have to, is a different question. So on one hand, I think comics are this extremely powerful way to represent the complexity of our thinking. And the flip side of it is I think they're an extremely powerful way to generate our thinking, and that's what I want to sort of wrap with here. In the chapter on imagination, I had a page about stories, the transformative power of them. And very early on, I thought I would do it on Scheherazade and the 1001 Nights Tale. And so that seemed like a productive thing, and I was playing with this idea that the sort of page would have stories within stories, and it would zither across in the way that Scheherazade's name did. And I would have these little zooms. If folks are familiar with the book Zoom, where they're in a postcard, and then we zoom in, and they're watching TV, and we keep going. Or Powers of 10, the film and the books where they're... Anyway, I would have these literal or metaphorical zooms. But midway across the page, I wanted to say by stories, I don't just mean the fanciful, but I also mean things like science. So had I been writing, I would have probably said, and by stories, I also mean things like science, and I would have put a period on it. But because, as I said earlier, I'm much more interested in embodying the work through the visuals and in the structure of the page, I had to find something that both suited this visual structure I was building and also was science. So I started looking started digging into what had been done in the time the Knight's Tales were written down and in the Arab Golden Age where they were written down. And I stumbled across a work by a man named El-Tusi, whose astronomical figurations were later used by Copernicus to do his big revolution. So I was over the moon because I'd already had a page on Copernicus in which the sort of main point was that nothing changed except the point of view, which changed everything. So I was like, all right, I had this page on Copernicus, things are coming. And so I spent about 3 weeks learning what he'd done in the astronomy, trying to figure out how I could make it work with the structure that I'd built of the page, to come out to what is those 3 lower panels there. So nothing in my notes said you should learn obscure Arab astronomy of the 1300s. That's not part of my proposal, not part of my notes. But what did tell me to do it is that I had to go from there to there, and I had to have something that talked about science through the pictures, and it had to actually teach the science too. It couldn't just be, let's throw Einstein in there because that's the easy thing to do. It had to actually be a real thing. So the work taught me where to go and took me in directions that I didn't expect to go. And I think that's a really crucial point about saying why this is important. And I want to sort of turn the corner as I close this to say a few words about my students. I'm going to show you one example. Most recently, I taught this class Comics as a Way of Thinking, and I primarily have had non-drawers or self-described non-drawers in my class. But we make comics from the first day, and we make work for their finals, and we keep doing it. And I find across the board that the act of making changes how they think and changes where they go with their work. And it doesn't matter about the skills. So the work I'm going to show is by someone I'm guessing you probably wouldn't put up at the National Gallery necessarily, because this was a very shy student. It was really difficult to get her to speak much in class, but did these extraordinary stick figure comics where her thinking just poured out. So like if we graded this on the basis of her artistic skills, wouldn't count. And if we graded it on grammar or whatever other rubrics we have in the world, it would be hard to say. But if we think about what she did in her thinking, this is one of the most extraordinary things that I've seen, and I'm only showing you a fragment from it. She did all this play with the boxes, these things which is very much about comics, these things that trapped her. And the whole comic, you don't see her face to the last page, which I'm not going to show. But she's moving through her thinking. I'm going to read the last page. So she makes her own box out of words, sounds, and pictures, and soon she learns that there is no need for borders, that borders restrict her unnecessarily since she can go anywhere she wishes. And I try to read it without getting teared up, but I think what's important in that, and what's hopefully important out of my own work, is that incorporating other modes let us go places we need to go, and let us discover things that we need to discover. So I think about it in terms of myself, in bringing these other modes, rather than sort of fitting pieces in, it opened spaces up, and that my research process became more journey, more sort of adventure of discovery than, you've got to fill in that last little brick that somebody's supposed to do. And I think as educators, as people, as students, as whatever we are, I think when we encourage those ways of learning to count, to be cultivated, I think it allows us to go in all kinds of directions that we need to go. And it's really something I hope as a society that we really embrace that and see the value of it. And I think that's very much what this institution is here to do. So with that, I want to say thank you.